Hello everybody, and this video is going to be about long-term planning and short-term planning in your chess games. So I found what is a very good example of this. This was a game played in the London tournament of 1922 between Capablanca, who was white, and Bogoljuboff. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, this game, I think, was played in Capablanca's 7-year unbeaten streak. So, unfortunately, I'm not sure if it's going to be a huge surprise that Capablanca does not lose this game. Now, the beginning was played like a fairly regular game. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. Bishop b5. So we have the Roy Lopez. And at this time, 1920s, this opening was seen as being correct for white. If you play e4, then it's correct for both sides to reach this position. Bishop c4 was sometimes played, but it just wasn't seen as being as of higher level as the Roy Lopez. Black continued correctly with a6, and white wants to retain the bishop pair. So the bishop's being threatened by the pawn, so he moves it back and not capturing the knight. So after knight f6, which is a mainline move, attacking e4, white doesn't defend it. Instead, he castles. There are moves that do defend the pawn. Knight c3 or d3 are playable, but at the time they weren't considered to be the best move. And if you play knight takes e4, not plays in the game, after rook e1, you normally trade off and it's fairly even, but white does have a very small plus. So Capablanca's opponent played bishop e7, which is a little bit rare for the time. Generally, you had either knight takes e4 or b5 being played. Still, it's not a big deal, because after rook e1, defending the pawn, b5 and bishop b3 is played here. So black now plays d6. Again, this is all textbook opening at the time. c3. So the reason for c3 is to allow the white bishop to come to c2 if black plays knight to a5, which was played about 99% of the time. What would happen is knight to a5, and again, black is trying to get the bishop pair. Black wants to have two bishops versus bishop and knight. White wants the two bishops because generally it's easier to play and it's generally seen as better to have two bishops in an endgame. So white would save the bishop, and now, because the knight is no longer on c6, black can attack in the center and gain a queenside space advantage with c5. And then white can either play d3 or d4. Both are fine. One's more combative, one is more slow and positional. And generally, black's pawn structure may not be as good as white's, but on the other hand, black has more space. I would say it's about even, generally. So this is what most players with white would expect after d6 and white replying with c3. This was played almost all the time. So in the book where I got this game from, which was compiled by Gombolek, he doesn't give a question mark, but he does seem to express some sort of surprise that black does not simply play knight a5, instead castles. So Capablanca has two options, really. The mainline move is now not really applicable because this was sort of a sideline at the time. So he can either transpose into the main line with h3, which was often played, discouraging bishop g4. So it would then be expected that black would go into the main line with knight a5, bishop c2, and c5 again. So then white could play d4. Then we'd have a regular game. But instead, Capablanca doesn't want to do that. He wants to play d4 quickly, which he does. And now, this is where the planning part of the video comes in. The thing is that what you'll see throughout this game is black has lots of short-term plans, short-term goals. White seems to not have anything in the short term, but he seems to have very long-term aims. So this is the first part of the strategic planning. Black, in the short term, may have got the position he wanted, which is a position that is not so common, and that way he may feel that Capablanca's opening knowledge is superior to his own, so by going into slightly new territory, he's nullifying that advantage, and each player is going to have to try and win based entirely off their own merits. What Capablanca has done with d4 is he has seized the centre in the long term. It's going to be very hard for black to combat white's central control. And here, Capablanca's opponent makes a mistake already. The reason you play e5 or c5 in response to e4 at move 1 is so that if white plays d4, you take it. That way white will not have two pawns in the centre. So he takes it. But white just recaptures with the c-pawn. Now, black has basically lost the e5 pawn. That was his stake in the centre. And white's lost the c3 pawn, which was taking up a very good square for his knight. So white comes off better here. White can now play knight c3, and black no longer has any control over d4 or f4. So I think what's a better move is bishop g4. Just keep the tension with the pawns, and this is a fairly even position. So after castles d4, yeah, I think it's a mistake to take the pawn. Capablanca does recapture. Now bishop g4, and there are a couple of good moves here. There's knight c3, and for the sake of an independent move, black can take the knight, and the d4 pawn would be under threat from the knight. So g takes is the only reasonable move. But after, say, rook e8, bishop e3, I still give an edge for white here because white's still got that strong centre, and now white has the two bishops. So that could be very useful in an endgame if the centre is opened up, which white should easily be able to accomplish because of his superior central control. So white will easily be able to open up the centre and make the two bishop advantage more than just theoretical. It will be practically strong as well. So here, knight c3 wasn't played though. Bishop e3 was played, which does allow the bishop to come out and be a bit useful. And then knight b d2 can be played without locking up the bishop on c1. Also, can you see what's wrong with knight takes e4? Yeah, white has a winning move here of bishop d5, forking the knights and also pinning the knight to the rook on a8. So black is going to lose a piece. Here, though, again, black's long-term aim isn't so clear, but the short-term aim is very clear. Get the two bishops. Knight a5, bishop retreats, and now knight c4. It doesn't matter which bishop the knight takes, as long as he gets one of them. So now the knight is forking the bishop and the pawn. So Capablanca, again, he doesn't want to get rid of the long-term advantage of the two bishops. He plays bishop c1 to defend the pawn, and he realizes that even though it looks bad undeveloping the bishop, he's going to attack the knight, and then the knight's going to lose a tempo as well. So white's development won't be as bad as it looks over the next few moves. c5 is played. So that's very thematic, gaining space in partly the centre, partly the queen side. But after b3, knight b6 might not be very good, because where's the knight heading to after b6? It can't go to a4, c4, d5. So it may not be so good there. Knight a5 is played instead to come to c6, where it has more control over the dark squares. And here, even though white has the two bishops and a slight space advantage in the centre anyway, opening up the centre would not be a good idea because black's pieces are better developed than white's. So e5 would not be very good because of takes, and black can now exploit white's development by queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and knight c6. Black's pieces are now very well coordinated. They're all working together to attack the centre. The bishop's pinning the white's knight. e5 is under attack now. And also black's rooks are connected as well. So almost perfect development. White's pieces, I can't say the same for them. And why can white not just win a piece with pawn takes knight? Yeah, bishop takes pawn. And now, how are you defending the rook on a1? You're not. You're going to have to play knight c3 and just lose the piece back in order to allow the rook to escape to b1. And even then, after a move like knight d4, white's clearly worse. So, not very good. Don't play e5. Instead, Capablanca just developed with bishop to b2. Very sensible. Knight c6. And here, the d4 pawn is under a lot of pressure now. So he pushes it. The knight comes to b4. So after all this time, the black knight is going to exchange itself for white's bishop. So black has succeeded in the short-term goal of winning the two bishops. There is the long-term goal attached to that is that his own two bishops will be better than white's minor piece combination. However, is that true? How can white argue against this? Well, after knight bd2 takes, all of white's pieces have developed, apart from the rook on a1, which is ready to jump into the action. And I'm not sure that the e7 bishop is any better than one of white's knights. So for this middle game, white is going to have to improve the pieces enough to show that the knight is better than the bishop. And with a closed-up centre, that should be fairly easy. So in the long-term positional aspect of this game, white is better in terms of piece play. What I think black is not doing here after rook e8, and there are several moves for white. Queen d3 was played in the game, but a4 would be very strong, attacking black's centre. Sorry, not centre, black's queen side. h3 questioning the bishop would be good, making it passive after bishop d7. But the move played in the game is queen d3. But here, black has two very important trump cards here, which he does not play. One is e5 is a weak square for white. After the move d5, e5 is weakened. So black could try getting a piece onto e5 with, say, knight d7, bishop f6, and then you've got the rook, knight, and bishop all controlling e5, as well as the pawn on d6 as well. That would be a very good continuation. Secondly, black has 3 pawns, a6, b5, c5, on the queen side against 2 pawns, a2 and b3. Therefore, black has an advantage on the queen side. That means black needs to push the pawns, create attacks, threats, target white's pieces, create an initiative on the queen side. But black doesn't do either of these things. I think knight d7 is clearly the best move, but instead h6, which I do not see the point to. But white realizes that, okay, black's doing well on the queen side. That means I need to improve my pieces and attack in the center, break in the center with my pawns, or break on the king side of the board. So knight f1, bringing a knight over to the king side. Now knight d7 is played. h3. So here it puts a question to black. Now Gombolek and I both agree on this. Bishop takes knight is clearly better than the move played in the game, because after queen takes, white no longer has a knight that is influencing e5. Therefore, bishop f6, and this is very good for black. I would go so far as to say that black is better here by quite a long way. If white takes the bishop, black will take with the queen. If white trades queens, then great. Knight takes queen, and then later on the knight and rook would be attacking e4, so white would defend it with, say, knight g3, and then perhaps either after knight d7 and then knight to e5, or black could even play rook a c8 and push the c pawn, try and get an initiative. So black is doing very well there. I think at least drawing. He could even just sit back and do nothing, and it would still probably be drawn. So unfortunately, black didn't adapt well to the change in position. He didn't just think, okay, the 2 bishops aren't so important in a closed position. Instead, he saved the 2 bishops, and now knight 3 to d2. So there are now no more exchanges offered by white. Black is going to be saddled with the 2 bishops. After bishop f6, white takes it. So black has realized too late that having the bishop pair is not so important. But even though he has the e5 square, it's become a little bit less useful in this position after white challenges the queenside structure. And here, because black has his light squared bishop, which is almost useless, white's 2 knights are probably going to coordinate and be better than black's bishop and knight. However, in the short term, black does come across a very good plan. Create a better outpost for the knight. e5 is good, but there's an even better one. c5. So he plays c4, pawn takes, knight c5. Very good move. And after the queen moves to safety, black can now take on a4 and has a passed pawn. Technically has 2 of them, a4 and a6. And is also blockading white's c-pawn. So this is very good for black in the short term, but you need to know how to use this in the long term. If I were black, I would swap off everything except for my knight on c5 and say white's knight on f1. And then I could use the passed pawns to win the game. White is not going to want to exchange. He's going to try and blast apart the center with the pawns. So after f4, queen e7, g4, bishop g6, and f5. So the reason that white is creating a nice zigzag with the pawns is to lock up the bishop on h7. Bishop's now in prison. And even though it's technically a good bishop in that it's on the same coloured squares as white's pawns, that's not so good because the bishop is just not able to have any safe squares. So here, white's knights are going to be very good because of the blocked nature of the position. However, black has the dark squares under control. So if I were black, I would play f6, queen e5, and just hold my position there. White is going to have to either break with the pawns or try and win pawns on the queen side. So knight g3, queen e5, king g2. I don't see the point of this, to be honest. I suppose it does allow the white queen to move, as the g3 knight is being protected. But after rook b8 and rook a b1, black missed a golden opportunity to win here. The strongest move is probably the most natural one, rook b2. So infiltrating along the 7th. If white does not take it, then rook e to b8 is going to be played, which will be a killer threat. So white does need to take. But after this, I don't see how white can not lose here, because rook b8 may be played later, but for now, a3, a2, a1, that's the big threat. So rook b1, queen c2, and now black is threatening the knight on d2 with the queen, so that pinning the knight, so that's something to bear in mind. The knight can't move, and even if it did, the rook on b1 would be hanging. And the pawn on e4 is being scrutinized by the rook, knight, and queen, as well as black having the passed a pawn that he can push to either deflect the white queen or to just push it to create the threat of promotion. So the best I could find was knight e2, but now knight b3 just seems to win on the spot. Knight takes d2 is being threatened, and if white takes the knight, then the rook is hanging. So this is a fantastic position for black. Unfortunately, this was not played. Instead, f6 was played, securing the dark squares and perhaps allowing the light squared bishop to escape. Knight f3 and rook b2 check. Takes, check, rook e2. So after queen b3, white does have several options. Queen takes queen is not good because a takes would just win for black. 2 connected passed pawns is too much. So white tries to, again, use pieces, not just material. Knight d4. And this is a very good move. I think it gives black the chance to go wrong. If queen takes c4, then maybe knight e6 would be very good. Or perhaps first rook e2, rook c2. And then maybe after that knight e6. And that way the knight on g3 can come to e2 and d4. But I think this is black's best chance. Just take the pawn and then put the rook on b8 and swing it down to b1, let's say. Instead, he takes queens off, rook b8, rook c3, king f7. I would play king f8 maybe, but king f7 is also good. King f3, rook b2, knight g to e2. So again, why isn't black working to push the pawns here? In the short term, the bishop is out of action, but it's going to take a lot of moves to do anything with that bishop. You're going to have to move the king, then play bishop to g8 to f7 to e8, and even then there aren't any good squares it's controlling, really. So what I would do now is I do my best to push the pawns. Now, that's easier said than done, but one potential plan is to, let's say, move a5, rook b4, and then maybe target c4 is a possible idea. But it's tricky to push the pawns. Or another easier idea is rook a2 and then play a3. So potentially that's good. And bishop g8, okay, it's not awful. Knight e6. Okay, now I'd play rook b3, I think. Just because it would swap everything off, and at least black would get a draw, if not win this. But instead, knight b3 is played, which is a losing move, because the trouble is that knight c5 was playing a really important role, blockading the white pawns. And now white gets a passer of his own. After c5, pawn takes, knight check. I would have played knight takes knight and then pushed a3, because again, I've got passed pawns as well. I need to push them. But knight d2, king f2, king e7. And black has not used the trump cards yet. Those two pawns haven't moved at all since quite a while ago. But white is just going to improve his own pawns. Knight b1, rook d3. So here, white's pawns are ready to, well, white's pawn rather, is ready to go up the board, d6, d7, d8. And black's pawn is now just a bit too slow. a3 was played in the game, but the move I would suggest would be king d6 to prevent white playing d6, and then to push the pawns. If knight takes a4, then perhaps after rook b4, knight c3, takes, I might just be okay as black. Maybe. It's still white who's far more likely to win, but maybe I could push a5, a4, a3, a2, a1 and distract white's pieces long enough to maybe sack the bishop for 2 or 3 pawns and be able to draw. Instead, though, a3 was played, but as I said, it's too slow. d6, check, king moves, and now white gets the last piece into the game with knight d4. Here, knight c6 is the killer threat, so rook b6, knight d to e6 check, and if the king moves, then d7 and d8 queen are winning. So bishop takes, pawn takes. Now white has 2 connected passed pawns, and the game's over. Rook b8 to prevent anything queening, but e7 check, king e8, knight a6. Here black resigned. Just to show what could have happened in the game, a2, and the simplest win is just knight takes rook, queen, d7 check, queen check, white's a rook up, and there's a mate in about 5 moves after queen d5, king moves, then queen f5, king moves, queen h5, king moves, rook d8, king moves, queen f5 again, and then finally, after the only legal move, queen d7, checkmate. So in this game, I thought what Capablanca did very well is he had long-term goals. He knew where to attack, where to put the pieces. Also, what was notable was he knew that the 2 bishops weren't that important in a closed position. And once black had that light-squared bishop on h5, he deliberately moved his knight to d2 to prevent any more opportunity for black to exchange his poor bishop, and also it allowed the f4 to f5 maneuver to lock up the bishop in the prison on h7, which ultimately, in practical terms, white was a piece up after that. So that became much easier for white to exploit his advantages and win. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.